All of you are in the tech sphere, and you've made a pretty compelling case that that's where the future is. So in terms of the Asia-Pacific region, I'd just like to ask each of you specifically, where do you see the opportunities, which countries, which areas going forward in terms of investment in the tech sphere? I'll start with you, Sam.
Okay, thanks for the introduction. So look, I think India is the obvious the obvious choice in terms of potential growth. And there we're talking about things like cloud services or consumer electronics. I think Indonesia is very interesting as well. I mean, you mustn't forget that Indonesia was, I think, the second biggest market in the world for BlackBerry after the US when, back in the day when people had BlackBerries. And so Indonesia is, of course, very interesting. The thing that is also interesting about these two markets, though, is that they're very challenging from a regulatory perspective, right? So in India, you've got Make in India, and Indonesia also has its own ambitions. And so those are things that can be very positive. I mean, companies can partner with governments to help them achieve their economic development goals. But if they pursue local content requirements and things like that in a way which imposes prohibitive costs on companies, then that can be a real drag. And plenty of other examples in the region. I'll let the other panelists weigh in on what the others might.
Let me ask all of you about, you mentioned the disruption, and you do have this sort of contradiction in the region where you have these very rapidly developing economies, but you then have hundreds of millions of people who are poor, who are living on the edge, who are living in villages. Where are they going to fit in an environment where, if investment is increasingly going into this high tech, are they in danger of being left behind? What it could be done to address that? And what's Huawei's experience? You've operated a lot in Africa, in the developing world in terms of this particular question.
Yeah, I mean, look, we often get asked by governments to localize either manufacturing or R&D, and one of the big constraints is, of course, skills. So we can only really set up an R&D facility if there's a deep enough talent pool of locally trained computer science grads or engineers or whatever. So that's the big constraining factor. But I think this is a very interesting discussion. This came up on a panel that I was speaking on in Dubai at the annual investment meeting about a month ago. And I think what you need to distinguish between is equality of opportunity and equality of outcomes. So equality of outcomes is a very sort of dystopian concept, but equality of opportunity is something that all governments should be striving for. So of course, there's going to be disruption. Now, I used to live in Indonesia before I took this role at Huawei, and one of the big jobs that people do in Indonesia, if they're relatively unskilled, is driving. And so as soon as you move towards autonomous driving, you're going to have hundreds of thousands of people out of work. So what happens to those guys? And I think the issue is that governments have a role to play in providing the opportunities for people to re-educate themselves, but the responsibility falls squarely on their shoulders to take the initiative and do that.
So I want to shift gears for a minute. The 800-pound gorilla in the room when you talk about the investment climate in Asia-Pacific is the US-China trade war. There's concern that it's going to go beyond trade, that it could lead to a potential decoupling of these two huge economies. It's going to have all kinds of consequences for businesses, for investment decisions, and so on. So I'd like to ask, and I want to get to the Huawei case since you're here, but I want to ask more generally, each of you, to what extent do you think companies risk being caught in the crossfire of the trade thing, particularly in the tech area? So how is this affecting Huawei's own investment decisions around the world?
Well, I mean, we weren't that exposed to the US market per se. I mean, we have quite a healthy rural broadband business. We sell a lot of solar inverters in the US. So an import ban or import restrictions per se are not going to impact the company that much. We have some R&D in places like Santa Clara that recently got their export licenses pulled, which means that the tech or the code that we develop there can no longer be exported. That needs to move somewhere else. There's a lot I could say about this, obviously, but there are a few things that I want to mention. So you talked about Singapore. That's very interesting. So I was briefing one of our frontline staff in Paris a few weeks ago, and I quoted Rahm Emanuel to him saying, never waste a good crisis, which is what Rahm Emanuel said to Barack Obama about the financial crisis. And I said, this represents a real opportunity for other markets who want to move into the space that's now going to be vacated by Google, Apple, and Microsoft. And so it really presents an opportunity to places like Singapore, where you have skills, where you have some capital markets, so you might want to trade your shares there or incorporate there. Israel is another example. The other thing I want to touch upon is decoupling. You said decoupling, and decoupling is really a very dangerous thing, and it's really the last thing that the world needs right now, as you have this established power of the US and China emerging. Remember the lessons that we learned after the Second World War, where the architects of modern Europe basically decided the best way to stop Germany and France from going to war with one another was to just integrate their economies, coal, steel, everything, and that decoupling really goes in the opposite direction. So what we need to see is less decoupling and more efforts to actually more closely integrate these markets to avoid these countries going to war.
Do you think, and this goes beyond just tech, do you see companies being put in a position where they're at some point going to have to face a choice? Either you develop your business in China and risk getting into trouble with the American authorities, or you adjust your business in some way, and I think that's the way it's and go elsewhere. You can't do both easily anymore.
Well, I think it represents an opportunity for markets like Singapore and Israel, as I mentioned, but it's also a black eye for the US, because what it's proven is that the US is a very unreliable place to register your patents, to be incorporated, or to trade your shares. Because if you do, you might have a government unilaterally decide who you can and cannot do business with anymore. So I think what it also spells is it's the beginning of the end of the duopoly that we've seen in operating systems in Google and Apple, and it's the beginning of the end of the monopoly that Microsoft has enjoyed in both the productivity space with Office, but also its operating system for laptops and computers. So, the Chinese are going to respond by developing those systems themselves now, and I think the world. Ultimately, as my fellow panelists have said, is the world moves on and the world adapts, but there's going to be some disruption in the short term.
Right. I have one more question about China, and then we'll open it up for questions from the floor, and that is you're all in the tech sphere, and I'm wondering, China has developed this extraordinary national surveillance system and use of facial recognition and all kinds of high-tech tools, some of which have become a bone of contention with the rest of the world. I'm wondering whether, in terms of tech companies doing business or investing in China, is this a potential issue? You've already seen some foreign companies singled out for criticism for doing business with Chinese entities that are operating in Xinjiang, for example. Is this a potential problem down the road?
I think there's some double standards being played here, because look at, say, Honeywell. Honeywell manufactures the centrifuges that the backbone of the US nuclear arsenal, or Boeing. Boeing makes the drones that are the backbone of the NATO armed forces in Afghanistan. And now in Afghanistan you have more people that have died at the hands of NATO-led forces than have died at the hands of the Taliban. But nobody questions Honeywell or Boeing. I mean, these are great companies, of course. People love to do business with them. Mm-hmm. But now all of a sudden technology companies like Hikvision and others are being called to task because of the uses that their equipment is being put to. And I think we need a more nuanced approach to this. If you were to make a company liable for every possible use that its products could be put to, then where would it stop? I mean, the water companies that deliver water to the base on Guantanamo would be held liable for the waterboarding that gets done there. I mean, at some point you have to be reasonable.
He's coming right up with a mic behind you, sneaking up on you.
Hi, my name is Neha Jetli. Quick question. We talked about the trade war between the US and China. Where do you see China's FDI going to, and how do you see China and India's relationship developing? And do you see China promoting a lot of FDI into India?
Yeah, right. So if you look at the data, there was a massive outflow. I mean, the outflow of FDI from China had been growing, since maybe 2010 quite exponentially, and 2016 represented the biggest sort of year, and it was after that that we saw CFIUS procedures in the US be tightened, and also a bunch of other governments in Europe, particularly Germany, tightening their investment screening procedures. But also the Chinese government saw this as something quite unhealthy, and so they also clamped down, and there was a huge drop-off in 2017 in outbound FDI from China. But the answer to your question is, where is the FDI now going, is Europe, right? India is a very attractive market, has a lot of things going for it in terms of just the size of the market, the level of skills you have there. Huawei's first overseas R&D center was in Bangalore because of all the great programming skills you have there. So India does represent some great opportunities, but of course, India and Brazil are known as being the two most difficult countries on earth to do business in, just from the regulatory environment. So the government needs to do a bit of homework, because I mean the investment's still going to come because it's such a big market. But the government could do things to make life easier for companies in terms of the regulatory environment and the efficacy of the court system and these sort of things.
Right. Anyone else? Yes, here.
Oh, just here behind you.
I'm just really curious to know, with Huawei, and maybe it's a question you don't want to answer because it might be personal. You're Aussie?
Yeah, I am.
So you're stuck in the middle of this.
I'm on the front lines of the trade war, yeah.
So your position's really interesting. Are you using yourself the Huawei network, and would you put your family on it? Are your kids in Australia?
My wife and my daughter are both Chinese citizens, live in Shenzhen. Right. So look, I think on the privacy thing, Mike touched upon this whole privacy issue. Look, China has very different values to Australia, and Australia and the Chinese economies are deeply interlinked. And it's really a question of sort of taking what you want and leaving what you don't, because I think China and Australia have very different values on certain things. And I think the relationship also has a lot to offer economically, commercially, and culturally. And so for Australia, they really just need to take what they want from China and leave the rest, because China is definitely going to do that. But I think what we've got is we've sort of got this wrecking ball president in Washington, D.C. that's really sort of inflamed things to the detriment of the US economy, the US tech sector, lots of economic sectors in the US, but also for the global economy more generally. And Australia has actually been caught in the crossfire because Australia has this very deep strategic relationship with the US, going back to the Second World War, but a very deep economic relationship with China. And so it's actually Australia that's caught in the middle, much less than myself.
Other questions?
Machine learning. So is anyone afraid of AI at all? These machines learn extremely fast, and they're capable of extremely sophisticated.
Look, I think I've seen all the Terminator movies. You can tell me which one is your favorite afterwards. But I think AI is like a tool, right? I mean, it's a tool. It's a technology like nuclear energy. I mean, are you afraid of nuclear energy? Yes, if there are idiots operating it, or if the safeguard protocols aren't properly managed, then yes, it can be very destructive. But it also offers huge benefits. I mean, Shenzhen is completely powered by nuclear. And I'm very happy about that until the day when things go wrong, of course.
Okay, we are unfortunately out of time. So lots to think about, lots to chew on. I'd like to thank Shailendra Kumar and Patrick Veal, Jeremy Little and Simon Lacey for a very stimulating discussion. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.